Great. Yeah, well, I just wanted to start by thanking you and Bernard and Dylan for engaging with us. Particularly, Bill and I are involved in a research project analysing colonial legacies and peace building in Colombia and Ireland, Northern Ireland. So for us, it's a wonderful opportunity, and we're very grateful for your time. And also to Robbie, of course, who is a mentor for us, or for me, at least. I'm sure Bill as well.
He taught me everything I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. Mutual mentoring. So it's brilliant to be here together today. So the idea really, and I would be sort of hosting, coordinating, is to discuss colonialism broadly. Like, what does it mean to you? How do you see it playing out in Ireland? Why are people talking about it or not talking about it? And then maybe we could look a bit further into the situation of travellers and the colonial effect. And then finally talk about Colombia, which is where Bill and I have been doing research as well. So it's a conversation rather than an interview, isn't it? So I will be happy to jump in as and when. But I just wondered, maybe just at the start, if you'd like to introduce yourselves. Just to introduce myself, I'm Claire Wright, and I'm a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast in the School of Law. So Bernard, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. My name is Bernard Sweeney. I'm an Irish traveller. I have no formal education, so nobody's discipline is under threat by any stretch of the imagination. But I do nip and pit various different kind of disciplines, from linguistics, biology, from sociology, from anthropology, from archaeology. But I know very little about them. But I was only taking snippets that I thought were fitting into my reality, the world I was seeing. So that's my formula, self-educated, you could say, in most regards. Also with a lot of experience, because I've experienced discrimination, racism, segregation, dehumanization, and all these various other labels. So with that, my interest in colonization is that I start to realize very quickly that this is nobody's fault, because it started centuries ago and we're all here now. And I think for me, it'll all be part of a healing process more than anything else, so we can move on and move forward. Not caught up in identity so much. I don't care so much about ethnic or indigenous. They mean nothing to me mostly. But narrative does. The same way if I was going around saying the Protestants were one way or the Catholics were another way, and I had some authority, well, then people wouldn't like that, and I wouldn't know. And I know this is not part of my introduction, so I keep quiet. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Bernard. Dylan, would you be happy to introduce yourself, please?
Dylan Foley. I'm from Sligo, like Bernard. We both live in Sligo. I'm an archaeologist, field archaeologist by trade, I suppose you could say, and experience for maybe nearly 20 years. But I currently studying in computers and archaeology, that kind of thing. But in terms of these kind of projects, I'm gonna have to switch that off. I study field archaeology of Ireland, like what do you call it? Specialize in, I don't really specialize, except field archaeologists don't specialize. We deal with all periods, so that's where my interest is. And when I'm working with Bernard, obviously we have an interest in the roots of colonialism in Ireland, which is, you know, how I get into this whole picture. Thanks.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Well, it's so nice to see you again, Dylan. Brilliant. Robbie.
Yeah, thanks. I'm still smarting under the notion I'm a mentor to Bill Ralston. He's definitely a mentor to me, I have to say. So I'm Robbie McVeigh. I'm a writer, researcher, and I suppose over many years I've done work with travellers around different aspects of traveller identity, traveller inequality, and so on. So I suppose I'll bring that to the discussion today. But I've also written with Bill, obviously, a broader analysis of colonialism in Ireland. So that will probably frame the discussion too.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robbie. Bill?
Yeah, Bill Ralston. I'm a retired sociologist. I was a sort of I suppose I share with you, Bernard, a sense that I never really focused much on one particular topic as a sociologist. You know, some would get a reputation for being the sociologist of this one thing for their whole career. I tended to follow things that I wanted to follow, and sometimes they were very disparate. But there is a strand that goes right through there, if you look back on it, that came to fruition when Robbie and I worked for a number of years on the book on colonialism, which wasn't so much that we discovered colonialism, but we finally started to put words on what we'd been at, what we'd thought all along. just add that we don't touch on the issue of travellers in the book. And I suppose, knowing now the conversations that have been had, we really should fill that gap if we were doing a second volume, which we probably won't. But I will say, sort of, where I'm coming from in one other aspect is that a lot of years ago in the 80s, I was a member of a traveller support group here in Belfast, which is long existent now, long out of existence now, that Paul Noonan was very involved in, and various other people. So I'm not totally ignorant of the topic.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much, Bill. That's going to make for a very interesting sort of conversation. So I wanted to ask you all, in the first place, how did you come to the topic of colonialism? When did it start to resonate with you? Has it always been there? Is it something that emerged? And like you said, Bill, you sort of put a name to it. Where has your engagement and thinking about colonialism come from?
Will I start saying I introduced that?
Yeah.
It's a funny sort of thing, because one of the things that Robbie and I say in the book, which was like 5 years in the making, and it's been out for 2 years, and we couldn't say it quite as easily now, thankfully, which was that it was such an obvious frame to understand Ireland that we couldn't understand why we seemed to be in this lonely little field to talk about it, In fact, there was a time when you raised the issue of colonialism, you tended to get marginalized as an academic. You tended to be frowned upon at very least. And when I look back on it, I think a lot of that had to do with the times in the North, coming from the North during the conflict. I think there was a prejudice that the only people who really seriously were talking about colonialism were also in some way or other advocating armed struggle, and that therefore if you were doing it, you were a fellow traveller at very least, or that you had to. I mean, it's almost, God forgive me, jumping in the deep end, but given the whole thing with Israel and Palestine at the moment, the way you have to preface, that with Palestine, if you're talking about Palestine, you always have to preface by Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, we had an equivalent sort of mantra in the North, which was that you distance yourself from violence before you were allowed to speak. And that therefore meant that really going down that route of talking about colonialism, imperialism, and especially issues that could get people very fussed, like settler colonialism. So for most people, if they even thought of it, they didn't pursue that issue. So, Robbie and his way did, I and my way did, not many of us did. And so in the end, I think what Robbie and I came to, and it was more Robbie pushing me than him, was to say, look, let's sit down, grab this bull by the horns, and try to say once and for all, how do we frame Ireland, past, present, and future, as a colonial issue?
Yeah, just to draw on that a wee bit. I mean, I Bill's dead right to say that we're talking in the context of what's happening in Palestine at the minute. It's really shocking, but it is a very simple reminder of the way that these things don't go away, that colonial history continues. So whenever you reframe Ireland in that way, I think it's important to say you're not doing anything unique about Irishness, because it continues in North America, it continues in South America, and it continues across the whole world. So that notion that the world is dealing with colonialism and its after effects is helpful in some ways, I think, to get around some of the issues that we used to have in Ireland around you can't talk about this because it's too divisive or too threatening for some people or whatever. So that's a significant change, and one of the reasons that happened is because of Black Lives Matter, I think, particularly in the States. That suddenly there was this moment when not just people in North America but everywhere else in the world was talking about a legacy that hadn't been addressed properly and still had huge consequences for, as I said, for the whole world. So in that sense, our book clearly addresses Ireland, but it tries to understand Ireland in that much wider context, and that's probably one of the reasons that people outside of Ireland have seen it as having some significance.
Perfect. Just to jump in then, I just wanted to say the full title of the book name for viewers and listeners: Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution, and by Beyond the Pale Books. That's the volume you're referring to. Bernard, Dylan, would you like to to join the
Yeah.
conversation?
Mine, I'm not quite sure when exactly I stumbled across colonization. It was in recent years, and I think it was probably through Dylan, because he had studied the conquests of Ireland and stuff like that. That's when I got to know more about colonization. But as a child, I grew up sensing it. I was curious to why were we called tinkers? Why are we called itinerants? Why are we called gypsies? And no idea. And then I was often wondering, why were the other children, where did they get them names from? Why were they calling it these names? Because they were just children also. So yeah, and then at the early stages, I really liked Star Trek, the original series. So that had me thinking also about meeting different species, different planets, their complexities, their difficulties, their challenges. How do you overcome them? Like there could be a species he was half white and half black. The first interracial kiss was on Star Trek. All this kind of stuff. So I was really impressed with that kind of stuff. So when I grew up with that, I seen in a guy called Malcolm X, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs about white liberals in their NGOs, their organizations, with their soft-spoken words, and they're going nowhere. Then I got to come across a guy called Martin Luther King. He was grand. He was a very more soft tone approach than Malcolm X. And then I almost fell in love with Angela Davis when I seen her in prison in 1972. So my life grew up around looking at other people, but not knowing colonization at this time. So my experiences were different. And it causes a lot of depression because when you get to a certain age, then you try to speak about things you don't understand. So my big concern was the settled mentality and the traveler mentality. And once there's two mentalities, there's two cultures, there's two different frequencies. Then I was curious of why are there settled people with the same surnames as travelers? And how could we be that distant and separated? And then I went into the NGO sector and I was even more curious about settled people. I was thinking, over a second, if we keep doing what the settled people want us to do, won't we end up like settled people also? And where would our identity go? Like if you were to go into some of the organizations, all the top jobs were reserved for people who had third level education. That means you had to go to a settled university. So all this stuff was bottling up, and I kind of pestering people. I was getting them trying to question the NGOs. I was saying, why have we not got our own traveler organizations? Like after 70 years or 60 years, or however long it is, all the organizations to this present moment were never set up by travelers. So travelers never had that freedom and they had to conform. And it's quite sad because we see a lot of travelers now who are very well educated and they're coming back with the same stuff that the settled people were saying to us all along, all the stuff that we had conflict with. So then you start to think more about mentalities and about institutions and about systems. Like if I was a child and I grew up in any culture, I would be convinced that was reality. And from that reality, I would see the world. But we know that, I just think I fell into colonization more so, but it was still on the path of trying to work out and be inquisitive. How do we end up non-existent? How do we end up no written history? We lived on the fringes. We have our own language. We have our own separate history. And that just, to me, was just kind of bonkers. And what you had then was you had on one side, the older generation travelers saying pretty clear that we were either put off by Cromwellian armies, that we existed during the famine, before the famine, that nomadism and moving around was a mentality, it was a mindset. And all of that was on one side. And then on the other side, we could call them, for the sake of now, NGO travelers, people who went into the NGOs and adopted a settled way. They came up with a narrative that was actually just bizarre. And travelers on the outside were having this huge conflict, saying that's not our narrative. That's not our history. Of course, later on, when you get a bit more mature. Now, in all that time, unfortunately, I didn't have access to libraries. I had no formal education. I couldn't read anyway. And then I was more and more frustrated because I didn't want to adopt an NGO model. Like they would say to me, if you really wanted to help, you would take a 1-year course in community development. If you really wanted to help, you would take this course and that course. And I was just thinking there's something not quite right with this whole system in the first place. But that actually backfired on me because you cannot and should not go through life without a formal education because it's a tool. It helps to unlock and progress. So I ended up being the villain because I was thinking, and I was lashing out. I was saying these organizations are doing more damage to us than good. And every time you try to speak of something, you're like, what are you talking about? Nobody understands you about mentalities and so on and so forth. So yeah, cut it very short. My colonization was a more lived experience and then becoming more aware about it. then that explained this and that explained that, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'll give it off to Dylan.
Thanks, Bernard. Dylan.
Yeah, I would. Well, I grew up in the same town as Bernard, so I guess that in the west of Ireland we would be, even I suppose on a personal level, the west of Ireland would be one of the places most hit by the things like the famine and most hit by things that were obviously colonial. And so I would have seen elements of that in my own, in our families and backgrounds and things like that, but I wouldn't have really understood it, no more than Bernard would have originally. Then I'd studied history in Galway. I studied briefly studied history in the department there, and I must say that Nicholas Canny and various others in that department were very good at framing history in terms of when we looked at Ireland in the 16th and 17th century, it was automatically framed in terms of Ireland and the Atlantic world. And so as one movement, one episode, in a sense, in the broadest sense of the word, the colonization of Ireland as part of the general move after 1492 by Europeans across the Atlantic and into America, and the connections to all of that. So I would have had awareness of that when I was out in the field, but I specialized more in archaeology then. And to be honest, going around in archaeology is funny. Although we learn all those things are not applied to to explaining anything in where I had grown up. They were like we would know the place was colonized, but like Bill had said, the South too had this amnesia about it. You weren't allowed to sort of connect that to what your experience was now. So if you were living in poverty and everybody had to leave, not myself, but like say, the west of Ireland in general was accepted that you still had to emigrate, that you still wouldn't have jobs, that it was still a very poor place. And the explanation for all of that is still, it was not so much that the colonization and all that was not a way that was regarded as some way we were going, that it was not something the government, for example, in Dublin was going to acknowledge and rectify in any way. It just accepted that that was the way it was. And of course, as an archaeologist, I worked on many places around the country where the world that had been destroyed by the colonization, or supposedly destroyed, this is the point, was relegated to archaeology, as if we were studying ancient Rome. And therefore there was an acceptance that the Gaelic world in some way had now entered the realms of fantasy. And what was kind of interesting, and I guess what would give me a bit of confidence about some aspects of that, would be in that when we literally opened miles and miles of ground on the road lines, and we'd actually see, for example, the old cottages, buildings, things like this. We would know that they didn't exist in Ireland, if you know what I mean. In other words, they just aren't there. The ground, those things aren't there. There's other forms of structures in Ireland that to do with the Gaelic world, but up until the 16th century in Ireland, 16th and 17th century in the West, and vast parts of the whole of Ireland, and particularly Ulster, there is no urban fabric, and it doesn't exist in the same way. And when you see that day after day in the field, the kind of things you're looking for, the Gaelic world is not so distant or not so unreal, if you know what I mean. And therefore, you'd automatically end up asking questions. Well, why is it relegated? If it's so recent in history that this world was still that as powerful a thing that the Elizabethans and Cromwell's Republic and everything, that it was instrumental in even creating English history. How is it, if that was the case, that suddenly it has nothing to do with where we are now in Ireland? And so, just like Bill, when I met Bernard, then we followed on through into like, well, this has to all make sense in some way, and all of Ireland is full of people who were really the flotsam and jetsam of that whole story in different ways. So that's where I would come from.
That's really interesting. One thing Bill and I have been looking at in the project is this kind of the links between the past, sort of colonial activity and oppression, and present day inequalities and ongoing forms of colonialism. And it seems to be what you're saying too, that's a lived experience for many people today. And I wanted to take a deep dive into a complex problem, if we can, which is thinking about the different layers or kind of like weaves of colonialism in Ireland, because we've spoken about the situation of travellers today, comparison perhaps with settled people. That's kind of one level, one very important level. And then we have the sort of historical British colonialism in Ireland and how that affected Irish speakers, Gaelic people who might not be identifying as travellers. How can we sort of unpack and reconcile those stories and those histories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I take one dab at it. I think you've often heard the colonial mentality. So I would see Ireland as deep in a colonial mentality. Kind of, why would settled people be calling these other Irish people tinkers? Why would they be calling itinerants? Why would they be using old English laws and systems against Irish people, or not having much knowledge of travellers? Now, when we go back just a little bit, as Bill will also know this, and Robbie, is that there was no labelled traveller. The labelled traveller didn't exist at a particular time. Doesn't mean the people didn't exist and the culture and the ethnicity didn't exist. We were called thinkers. And if we weren't called thinkers, we were called itinerants. And both of them labels are centuries old. And they were brought here by the English colonizers, because there is no itinerant or thinker in the Gaelic mentality. They're an English construct. So when we see people like, that's it. I think if you to visualize travellers here, native Irish over there, some other group there, well, I would say that's thinking in the colonial mentality, because you're already doing the same thing by categorizing these people. So the whole idea of stepping outside the colonial mentality, that there is no label travellers, there is no label sort of native Irish and so on, so forth, or there is no Protestants for that matter, there is no Catholics, and there is, because the Gaelic world was already a complex, diverse world. It didn't have nationalities and so on and so forth. It was more based on genealogy. Who's your people? Where do you come from? And so on and so forth. So I would say that there's a very small distinction between native Irish and travellers, or indeed anyone who claims to have any part of the Gaelic culture. So rather than see it as in the framework of one group here and one group over there, once you come outside it, you will see a kind of a different projection. You will see travellers at the very top with the worst statistics. But then you'll see Protestants who were suppressed. Then you'll start to see native Irish who were suppressed. Then women in general were suppressed. And that was all part of the squashing of the Gaelic revivalism come 1916. The state was almost by default suppressing it. So I don't see no big distinction between there are the travellers and then there are the native Irish people. And I know Robbie kind of touched on this before. It's kind of like saying, if we are claiming indigeneity or indigenous, whatever one of the labels, is saying, who are these people? The question is, who are they now if they're not indigenous? And why aren't they indigenous? And that's pretty much where I'm at with that, I think. It's pretty much checking a step outside of all the colonial labels. Again, if you look at the signs, they'll tell us that we go back so far, we all come from one gene pool, that there was no thinkers and travellers. So the destruction of the Gaelic world, such as the Vagrancy Acts from 1536 in Dublin, where they were chopping off ears and they were hunting down fortune tellers and palmistries and proctors, or whatever that word is. And what I always liked about it was they were also chasing down people with fantastical imaginations. In other words, people are going around causing trouble. So from there, you could say, from this gene pool, this once complex society, these labels started to be applied. So you had the wild Irish, the enemy of the empire, the wild Irish, the wanderers, the vagrants, the vagabonds, the itinerants, the tinkers, the travellers. To me, that's one continuation of the same people with different labels. And how we know this? We always kind of knew this, but I would say it used to be a good feeling. But with that good feeling, now we have the satisfaction of saying we've got microbone, which is backing up our good feeling by telling us that we didn't come from an industrial world. In other words, we didn't come from a settled world, because the industrial world actually came from colonization. So we didn't come from there. We had two schools of thought. And he would have said, Fergus Shanahan, he would have said that if we go back 5 or 6 generations, the bacteria that we have now, or I won't say we have now, but whoever has it now left, would have been identical or very similar to his ancestors. So therefore, we, again, remove the labels, go back in time, we're into a broader Gaelic society. I'm not sure if that answers your question at all, but there you have it.
It does, definitely. If anyone else would like to join in.
Yeah, I want to come at it a slightly different way. Bill was right to say that our book says very little about travellers, but it doesn't say much about settled people either. It doesn't really address that question of where do these people come from, but it does frame the broader experience of colonialism in Ireland. And I think that's really significant, because the broad brush that we employ suggests that this is something that affected all Irish people, and it doesn't mean that all Irish people are the same, or there weren't massive class and ethnic and racial and gender differences in Ireland before colonisation, but it does suggest that the process was something that subjected all of them to a particular experience, and and that's from the flight of the Earls down to the poorest Irish peasants who were colonised at different periods. So that's a significant point to make. It's not to suggest that there shouldn't be more work done around gender and ethnicity and all the rest. Of course there should, but it is to suggest there's a commonality to that experience, which is really significant. But to draw that out a wee bit in terms of what Bernard was saying, I would also point to the, if you make the comparison with Native Americans, certainly Native North Americans, let's work with that one. Native Americans didn't really exist before colonization, because what you had was, a huge, like hundreds, if not thousands of distinct cultural groups who were different, had different languages, different, because all the rest of, in terms of contemporary ethnicity, it's quite clear that they were nations rather than one group with a homogenous culture or language. Right? So that the point I'm trying to make about that is that it's actually colonialism that constructs the category of Native American and imposes upon it. And then if you agree with that analysis, and you have to say, well, what do you do with that history now? What happens in terms of acknowledging both the incredibly complex nature of the history that was there before colonization, but at the same time acknowledging that what comes out of colonization is completely different, not least because it has now constructed this category of Native American, which people have to organize culturally and politically around. Now, if that's right, I think you can at least compare with a similar experience in terms of travellers, and indeed other groups as well. That these groups emerge out of the colonial experience, and that's if we really want to understand the contemporary meaning of issues like indigeneity for both settled people and travellers in the Irish context, then you have to begin by framing it in terms of the colonial history and seeing how colonialism, and more particularly the colonial state, constructed these groups, how it actually defined them in a way that they can't ever escape from. Like, all of us have to respond to those politically now in terms of where we're at now, rather than the way we were 1,000 years ago.
Okay. Bill and Dylan, I don't know if you want to add.
I think one of the loveliest ironies following on from that in an Irish context is the importance of counties in people's consciousness, especially if they're heavily into GAA things, and the counties are a colonial invention. There weren't counties in Ireland before that, and yet they are as real or as meaningful to everybody now as if they'd existed from time immemorial. And so it's good. I'm going to introduce a wee sort of query here, if you don't mind. Yes, making comparisons to Indigenous people in North America, as you did, Robbie, or saying how much you came into this way of thinking through looking at Black struggle in the United States, Bernard. These are all very good, but sometimes people listening from the outside would see this as terribly facile. We're not Indigenous Americans. We're not. None of us here. None of us are African Americans. And I think of a couple of funny things. One is, do you remember the Commitments, where the band said that we're the Blacks of North Dublin, and it was good for an entertaining film and everything else, but it was a bit of a sort of a metaphor rather than a statement of profound philosophical import. Even worse was when Gerry Adams once tweeted about people in West Belfast being the Blacks of Ireland. He got dog's abuse for ages afterwards in the media. So what I'm saying is that for all that there's commonality across colonialism in the world, I think we also have to look at the specifics of what it means for each of us, and for each of us on this island, and also to divide that among the different ways in which we come to this conversation or come to this point in history. You're coming, Bernard, from a a traveller background. I'm not. I mean, if I go back far enough, I can't trace it far enough, but I can by my name tell you that my roots are in planters who they traveled to get here, but they weren't travellers, you know. So we have to acknowledge that, as it were, alongside this commonality, there's also specificity, and it's how we put all that together that's important.
Yep.
Do you want to reply to that, Bernard, and then Dylan? Or
Dylan looks like he wants to come in.
Yeah, go on.
I'd say something. Yeah, that's interesting with the counties, actually, because I'm studying that at the moment. It's actually one of the ways just using names with counties is still functions, say even in the Republic here in the south. Counties are the established. Obviously, they're still by laws, the established things. And actually, one of the ironies when I was studying archaeology was that we would map monuments and everything based on how many of these were in this county. How many castles in County Sligo? How many counties? How many castles in County Roscommon? And it took us a long time. It took me a long time to figure out that actually County Roscommon didn't exist when any of these castles were built.
Yeah.
Why were we doing this? You know what I mean? And therefore we can't explain a lot of and this still goes on, where we can't explain a lot of our own data because we're using the things constructed afterward that were actually made on purpose to cause a break in our understanding to the link to the past. In terms of the identity stuff with what Robert was saying is very true. Those we can actually see in 16th in English descriptions older forms of that kind of term of settled, that we're still using language like settled and traveller as if and we kind of all understand there's some kind of fundamental difference there. But yet those would have been things from, say, Dublin's administrative point of view. The idea that there was wild and civil Irish was taken for granted by them in the past. And I think that the language we still use is still the language coming from that perspective, which is within, like, what your publisher's name, what you published under, within the pale and beyond the pale.
Yeah.
And by mentioning the pale as well, I'm just going to say that like what Bill is saying, that's a very important point, is that it's not just what's interesting about this when they created this new identity, and other people might know a lot more about this than me, but in the 19th century and in the 20th century, me and Bernard had looked at some of this with some of our discussions. There was a national identity recreated, and in this identity, Dublin in particular as well had this role, partly Celtic revival, partly other things, in creating this modern Irish identity, which was this uniform, singular identity across everyone who's here, it's Catholic, it's this, it's that, whatever. And what it served to do was not only suppress kind of like, it suppressed two angles. The Gaelic history, they constructed in a kind of, romantic sense, even as they were presiding over the destruction of the Gaelic world, the last of it, in a large swathe of the country in the 1847 famine and that. So even as it was disappearing, it was adopting itself this kind of an Irish identity. And the short of it is that it actually ends up suppressing both Gaelic world, but also Dublin's English history and the history of the colony in Ireland. The English colony in Ireland is not something that appeared in the 16th century to make it clear that suddenly arrived with the armies and destroyed this Gaelic world that was sitting there pristine. Well, that's not at all true. Obviously, we know that Dublin had been a colony, an English colony, since the 12th century, and an identity had formed there, that the colony in Ireland that was both that classic identity between the two worlds, where those that identified were regarded as English in Ireland, but when they went to England, they were regarded as Irish. But in Ireland, obviously regarded as English. But the Pale maintained an English identity very firmly in its structures and law and all the rest of it, right through the 12th until the 17th century, when the division then became about religion. And because the Pale were English in identity but remained Catholic, found themselves now having to create an Irish identity in line with other Catholics. But I would say that it's important to recognise that, because the missing the missing English history of the South and of the island in general is actually as much of a problem as we would say as the Gaelic world missing. The two it causes a lot of confusion, because if you try to explain Irish history and you just divide it on Catholic Protestant or divide it on native lines, or everyone was indigenous at some point or anything like this is just not the case. Because even in, as Bernard, we would look at, even in traveller community, we have a cross section of Gaelic society, which in some cases would have Norman names, some cases would have obviously a lot of them are native names, some are even English names, because we have Catholic, for example, Catholic aristocracy refugees essentially from England, from the Reformation in England, who end up marrying into Gaelic aristocracy. And in fact, some traveller families still even have those names in them. Now, I think that a lot of that history gets lost when we we're not dealing with either of them correctly, because we have this kind of modern 19th and 20th century idea of a national identity. And that's what I would say there.
That's really interesting, Dylan. In terms of this idea that the state, so inverted commas, post-colonial state, wants to like delete the past, we find that in Latin America too. It seems to be a feature of states that have been part of colonial enterprises and empires, that they might take elements from the past and what seems to be the past that are favourable to their national vision, but sort of everyday commonalities of indigenous peoples, for example, are sort of wiped out with this sort of homogenizing vision. So there seems to be a logic to the colonial mentality and also to the post-colonial mentality, if we can call it that. But I just wanted to invite Bernard back in, as Bill was talking about resonances with people's situations elsewhere, and we've been talking about differences and similarities, how you see that playing into the sort of history and experience of traveller people in Ireland.
Yeah, I think when we think of colonization, when we talk about colonization, we automatically think about the physical aspects of it. I think the part that went over, forgive the pun, over people's heads was the psychological colonization, which was a very carefully planned, orchestrated adventure in itself. You had various different Edmund Spencer and people like this talking about putting the sword to the tongue, about making them dependent on the state. Then you had penal laws stripping away people's identity and culture and making them shame. And I think that's what might be missing from the book. It's because both of you are coming from the sociology, and you wanted people to know what is happening now, and to let them know what's happening now, you had to give them a bigger picture. You had to give them a bigger framework so that you can focus on then the relevance of it all in the present. So I think the psychological part, because even Nicholas Canny and all these great historians did not have the traveller take on it. They didn't have the traveller psychology behind it. Because again, we are all human beings around the planet are 99.9% genetically related. We all originated from one source at one time or another. So it does get complex because we're talking about mentalities and philosophies and so on and so forth. And I think on the nation states and the empires who lay claim to all history as their own, Dublin have done that remarkably well. But that is also a very popular thing. There's a guy, European historian, Timothy Snyder, and he talks about nation states and how they lay claim to the past, and it is not true. I think Dublin has done that. I think the only thing didn't become a conflict of Dublin's maintaining that nationality or that identity was who were these people on the island with a distinct culture. Now, if you look at the traveller culture, and Bill, I'm sure this must have crossed your mind, and Robbie, is that if you look at the Gaelic culture, the intermarriages, who they marry, who they won't marry, their rituals, their call-outs, their arranged fights, their arranged weddings, I mean, that's still echoing throughout with travellers today, which kind of fits nicely in with a Gaelic culture. So if you apply the geneticists, which I know it's a touchy one, some people don't like it, that's fair enough. But I use it just for the sake of using it for a map. Because the notion in Ireland was that all travellers were going around aimlessly and just making pots and pans, and we're outside of history, and we've nothing to do with the Gaelic history, we've nothing to do with the Irish history, and we're just there, other. Nobody knew anything about us. And I think that was constructed by the state, because I know there was a lot of resistance even to talk about the 60s. They didn't really want to talk, when I said they, our support groups, didn't really want to talk about the 1963 report. When we got there eventually, then we started to realize, and it took me 20 years to get a copy of that book. But anyhow, I got it eventually. And then we're looking at, myself and Dylan and others, we're looking at it, and we're saying, oh, for a second, they're referring to themselves as settled people. When we didn't put the label settled people on settled people. And this is the part I think that everybody has missed, is that they're the only group in all of colonization that really hasn't been studied. Now, Ireland was one of the first overseas countries to be colonized, so it has a kind of a distinct beginning origins. Dylan will tell you that they took all of what they did in Ireland and they brought it to the Jamaicas and the Caribbean islands and so on and so forth. So there's a follow-on export of, and a lot of our people through the transportation laws, Sweeney's, McDonough's, all these traveller names were deported off the country. So we know there is that connection. I think this goes back to Robbie or Bill also about the connection we have with around the world. Again, I said about the 99.9% genetically related. There's another aspect I picked up on, and it was through biology when I was taking a course watching YouTube videos. But he's a wonderful guy. His name is Robert Sapolsky. And he wasn't talking about colonization, but I was always looking for these kind of ways to try to explain things because I had no way of explaining them. And he would talk about the frontal cortex being a critical point of critical thinking. I know very much about it. But he also talked about the limbic system, and it has various functions, and we store our memories and our short-term memories and all of that. So that, to me, was a way of trying to explain another way of colonization, the psychological colonization, because settled were never taught about themselves. So therefore, they were the normal default Irish. And this is why they see travellers as a group out there. But in reality, we would say back with science, with 3 branches of science, is that they have the narrative the whole way around backwards. Is that if they had started with their settled identity, where did settled systems come from? Where did settled culture come from? Where did the language come from? Where did their institutions come from? It all goes back in roughly around the 16th century colonization. So if you even look at the system today, they call the elites, the middle class, and the working class, which we didn't come from them either. We didn't come from the colonial constructs. So when we see them, we just see like the same language channel being used. In other words, we're all speaking in English. We can communicate with one another, but we've got different frequencies going on. So this brings me back to the limbic system and the frontal cortex. Why do we have similarities? Well, we all have a human mind, and it's very unique to that person. But there's one thing we don't have that's so unique, our thoughts and our belief systems, and they are stored in our limbic system. So if you grew up with it as a child, not knowing much and adopting this language, these customs, and taking them as a given reality, well, you'll die hard on a hill believing in that. So our connection with other groups around the world is that there's a particular mentality, the one that erases history, the states, the empire states, and so on and so forth. And as Robbie said, construct these labels from like native indigenous originally came from the colonizers. They were first referring to plants, I believe, and so on and so forth, and then it became to people. So this is where indigenous and ethnic and all these kind of labels come from. Again, I'm not sure if I'm going anywhere near answering your questions, but it's good to rant on too, isn't it?
Super interesting. I want to ask, in academia, particularly since this context that Robbie's been talking about, Black Lives Matter 2020, there's a lot of talk about decolonizing, the decolonial. Academics are talking a lot about that, and social movements have been talking about that for even longer. But I wanted to open up that question to yourselves. If we consider there still is a colonial effect or colonial mentality, colonial institutions in Ireland, how could we think about sort of undoing those institutions? Is it possible? And how could we go about doing that?
Well, I'll briefly talk on it, and then I'll throw it over, because there's this guy, and the reason I'm saying this is I forget his name, and I am sure if I talk about him for a moment, he does a lot around trauma. And he was saying that even because it's all psychological, the trauma, and what we're doing here is psychological, the labels are psychological. And he was saying that you can switch off trauma like that, the one that you stop, and you can say, well, actually, I know now how I got here. But like myself, I'm a living testament to that, because I went through very dark patches. But it was knowledge, it was understanding. And then when I understood, that explains that, this happened, this would explain this, then you start to relieve yourself from all them pressures and stresses, and you start to live a little bit. But I think it's very possible, but it'll take a different kind of platform, because I'm tinkering around, again, the pun, with all these different disciplines. So I'm not coming from one particular discipline or another. And it isn't one thing or another. It isn't like I can say it's something to do with linguistics. It's something to do with biology. It's something to do with, it's absolutely everything in one. Because from 1922, with the threat of war within 36 hours, that if they changed the institutions, now I think was Douglas Hyde and James Connolly and people like that talked about changing the institutions. And if you didn't, so be it, and so on and so forth. So what happened after generation was people grew up believing this was reality and the state was always here, that the language was always here. And in actual fact, if you go to Dublin and they told you that, they would be telling you the truth, because Dublin wasn't really colonized. Dublin was part of the empire. They're the guys that ushered in all these systems and institutions at a national level. If you take Regina Doherty, I think her name is, she's a senator, and there a while back, she was on some RT program, and she said, you know, she didn't understand why people were always to do with COVID, the virus. And she had said that, well, there's been a common travel area for 800 years between England and Ireland. And of course, everybody got upset about that. But what they were missing was, in her mentality, the one she's used to, that would be very true, that the English and Dublin were one and the same. But since 1922, with no institutions changed, Dublin claimed an Irish identity. And while they were doing it, they took in what I would call the surrendering regrant generations that started in the early 1600s. No one's fault, because one generation after another grows up in this environment. Like we're all here talking now, and we believe we're in a sense of reality. They're in the same language and we're communicating. So Dublin claimed that identity, and while it did, and it was working pretty well, because nobody's ever questioned themselves. Let me put it this way. Have you ever read a paper, a history book, any kind of report on settled identity? You haven't, but you've read endless stuff on Protestants and women and this group and that group and travellers, but never on settled. Because again, if you did start that, it's a crumbs of bread. It's kind of going back, and it has an origins, because again, we didn't come up with the label settled. The English created these labels. So sorry, yeah. Real short and quick, is there a way out of it? I do believe so. I know I do rant on a bit because it's taken a lifetime to get here. To you guys, it's all new, but for me, it's been 40 years of living it. So I do believe that there has to be something that's completely different. One, we have no hostility about the past. The travellers are not that caught up in past. And it kind of used to piss off the settled people when they couldn't tell them about the past. Well, we didn't care because we were living it. We were the people, and we were sharing the stories, and we had our culture. And it wasn't like we're on Green Hills and we're really enjoying it. We were put into a psychological prison. So we would see almost the Republic of Ireland as an open prison for travellers. Because as I mentioned, there isn't no traveller organisations. There isn't actually a narrative that's challenging the state on colonisation, rather than accepting it for funding and so on and so forth. Not an overly criticism, because a lot of this is subconscious. We grew up with it. I'll stop ranting now, my friend.
Thanks. Would anybody else like to make a contribution?
Yeah, I have Bernard. There's always something very profound in the middle of all of that, and I think that your point about settled identity is absolutely spot on. It's like really, you know, everybody who's non-traveller, let's say in an Irish context, should reflect on that and think what that means, and because it is as profound as I would suggest. But I suppose just on that, I would say, you know, ethnic interfaces are always like that at one level, because your identity can be defined positively, like as a Black person or a traveller or whatever, and then the other side of that can either be seen as something else, or it can just be not traveller or not Black or not Indigenous or whatever. So ethnicity is profoundly dialectical in that way, and you just have to accept. But having said all that, you're still absolutely right that, you know, if you think of the huge resources that have been spent on that question around who are travellers, and think of a tiny fraction of that have been spent on what does it mean to be settled in Irish, yeah, it would have moved the politics of that debate on a lot further than we have. But I suppose the other thing I wanted to say before we move on is that I slightly disagree, I guess, in the kind of nature of the state. And I suppose what I would would observe is that under the colonial state, as I was suggesting before, in the Irish context, then for the vast swathe of Irish people, your best hope most of the time was that the state would just leave you alone. The state never acted positively in your interest. It was something that usually repressed you, certainly discriminated against you. And as I say, most of the time you just wish that you could have as little contact with the state as possible. And only the colonial settler population benefited, in a proactive way from what the state did. I think that did change with the establishment of the Free State. And I think it would be it's too simplistic to kind of suggest that state is just the English state in Ireland in another form, and why that matters in the context of discussing traveller identity and non-traveller identity is because, for me anyway, that's a key moment, and precisely because, before partition, before the establishment of the Free State, as I said, for most Irish people, the state is just a negative thing that doesn't work in your interest. After partition, clearly the state in the 26 counties is working in the interest of a lot of people who do regard themselves as Irish and have, some connection to Irishness, however you want to deconstruct that. So the important thing about that is that it's at that point that traveller identity suddenly becomes constructed in a new way by that state. It is a post-colonial rather than a colonial construction. And I suppose, again, what helps us understand what that means is to think about that in comparative context with the North. As we've said in discussion before on Travision, that the interesting thing in the North is that travellers most of the time were just constructed as the scum of the Irish, as a senior police officer described them. So they were just the worst aspects of Irishness. They weren't a separate ethnic identity, but the separateness of travellers was absolutely a construction of the Commission on Tenantry and everything that's followed since. So it's actually a product of the post-colonial state, not a product of the colonial state as we knew it before 1922-23. And so there's definitely a difference in my reading of what that's about and what Bernard was saying before, I think.
Do you think, Robbie, then that maybe that the state come 1922 subconsciously adopted all of the English systems and institutions? Like we see in 1963 where they're referencing old English laws.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, and where that
just on that, say, like,
yeah.
Again, even the traveller label itself wouldn't mean all that. It wouldn't have been out there around the 1920s. Travellers again refer to themselves sometimes as pavvies and minkers, but that's only in contrast to somebody who isn't.
That's
in the same way, there would be no traveller label if there wasn't a settle label, and there'd be no settle label if there wasn't a traveller label.
Yeah.
History tells us clean true, quote true, that the English travellers were also identified well before that. 1911. You had the local county council in Athlone talking about a guy called Edward Shirley, who was an English guy in 1911, and he applied for a labourer's house. But also Tinker McDonough had applied for this house. So Mr. Kelly and Mr. Flanagan were having this debate among other politicians. They were talking about, well, what about if the tribes come along? What about if the clans come along? So in 1911, they're already identifying these people as part of clans, tribes, and so on and so forth. So come 1922, they did try to give the impression it was something new. But 1922 also followed on by suppressing the 1916 uprising follow-on. In other words, the Gaelic revivalists, women in 1937, the Protestants who were part of the Gaelic revivalists, they got suppressed. So a lot of people got suppressed in 1922, not because it was a new state, because it was continuing from the old one. Like if you can pick out to me an institution in Dublin now that has changed and is Irish, then I would be start to convince. But Trinity College, Maynooth College, all the Queen's colleges, the political system, the land rights system, even the Irish Constitution is based on English law. All the Irish laws are based and rooted in Westminster. So it's kind of lifting up that veil of what it is to be Irish and settled. Now, for me, again, it comes back to all of what's more important. We're all here now, regardless of our labels. We can't change the physical past, but what we can do is change how we think about the past. And I think as long as travellers are boxed into 1922 to the present day, I think this is why there are so many travellers dropping dead and killing themselves. We know that children as young as 9 have taken to suicide. So in the physical world, it looks okay because we've eradicated all the cultural elements. So now it's just a traveller in the house. But what people keep missing, I believe, is the psychological effects of colonization, the things you cannot really truly see. And at the present moment in Ireland with travellers, I feel, as I said earlier on, that we're in an open prison. We have no NGO of our own. We have no voice of our own. We have no way of creating a means of production or anything on our own because we're surrounded with well-intentioned, more times than often, well-intentioned people who are trying to help the problem here and the now, but our problems are very deep-rooted in history. Yeah. So that would be my take on it.
Yeah, can I just speak? I would say that I think this actually highlights what I was saying earlier, which is the necessity for understanding the English colony in Ireland. Because when we use the word English, and we probably don't have the proper language for dealing with this. This is one of the problems of decolonizing, is that the language isn't quite up to the task. So we're speaking English. The big beneficiary of say like the conquest in 1600s would have been not just people coming in as settlers and that, but also the original English colonists who were, in a sense, a competing Irish identity. And it's very important to understand that what we ended up in the island, even by 1600, because they've been there 400 years, is a state being constructed by a competing Irish identity on the island. One that thought that it was more legitimate, was more Catholic, had a special piece of paper from the Pope that said it was supposed to be in charge of the country, and that it was civilized and bore the imprimatur of Rome. And a lot of the reasons they reckon, I mean, certain historians have suggested, and I'd agree with it, that the reason the Reformation bypassed Dublin and places like the Pale was because they would have lost that claim that had come in the 12th century to be the superior, to be the ones that were supposed to be the actual Irish, okay? And what me and Bernard would have said is that gets somewhat suppressed after the Reformation, and you've got the colony, and we're all aware of it, the Protestant ascendancy, and they are in charge for the next few centuries. But in 1922, when you remove it, I think it's very difficult to explain why the Irish state would suddenly start to nominate travellers, and it is even managed to not revive the Irish language, as to say it's not just travellers. But like by the 60s, they've decided that they're using, as Bernard says, continuations of English law, vagrancy acts, many things like this that go right back into the 1500s. Now, why would Dublin suddenly, why would it be continuing with this? Why would the mechanisms of law, it's not just that law carries through, but also what it's rooted in, we would suggest, and I would suggest, is in the competing Irish identity that had somewhat been suppressed during the imperial time, if you know what I mean, but actually had been fully formed even by the 1600s. What we now call settled identity is an English-speaking identity, is one that really is the English culture on the island. And we have to recognize that that Irish culture is partly an English culture, obviously. I mean, we're speaking English, we're living in English houses, we're living in English cities with an English, we use English law, common law, and of course, almost all aspects are to some extent indistinguishable. But this was something that was created by Dublin and the Pale. And in its competition with the Gaelic Ireland, it decided that this is what's Irish. And therefore, in 1963, it has no choice but to declare anyone who doesn't conform to that is not, if we're the real Irish, then they must be not. And therefore, they can be altered, and it's justified to do so. And that's what I would suggest the difference. And I would suggest that it's not something that emerges in 1922. It's the re-emergence of an older, a much older conflict on the island that's actually underneath, and is actually to do with the history of the formation of states, things like that. You can get into that kind of thing. And we call it English because Dublin was English. In Ireland, it has an added complexity that it wasn't people within our own country. You know, it was coming from external thing, an external colony, but it kind of predates modern colonialism, if you know what I mean. And yeah, and if you understand, I think all I'll say is that it's very important to have this Irish English identity as the identity that's creating the state and is legitimizing it constantly is something that actually is underlying it. And if we don't understand that, we can't decolonize properly.
Claire, you started by asking about decolonization, and I've got very mixed feelings about this because, I mean, decolonial studies is a big thing in academia now, worldwide. But in the UK context, for example, you've got all sorts of decolonial scholars now, coming from different backgrounds, whether sociology, history, English literature, whatever. But on the one hand, I get the point that if you go back to the likes of Douglas Hyde, for example, saying that we need to have the de-Anglicization of Ireland, or you go back to the likes of Padraig Pearse saying that the Irish tongue, the Irish language is the Irish mind, and yet most of the scholars in the UK context are not colonized or were not colonized. If anything, they're coming from the roots of colonizers. So I wonder what it would mean if you could sort of flip that and say, okay, we're going to have decolonial studies, but it's only going to be run by people who were colonized, and they're going to define what decolonization means. And I think if they did, a lot of them would argue, and they're also, sorry, just to say, there are also different ways you could come at being one of those colonized people, you know, whether you were Irish or whether you were an Irish traveller or whether you were an Irish traveller woman, you know, there's all sorts of levels of it or whatever. But I think that one of the things that they'd have in common would be to say that what we're talking here, despite what Hyde and Pearse and others meant, we're talking about something about more than just changing mindsets. We're talking about changing structures. Now, there are limits to that. Just to go back to Dylan here, you know, how will we go back to designing living places as they were somehow before colonization happened? You know, it would be an impossible task to decolonize every structure, but there are some structures that are obvious that need to be decolonized, and this is where I see the similarities between the traveller experience in Ireland and the Black experience in the United States, or in the Indigenous experience in Canada or whatever. That if you look at some of the structures of poverty, of substance abuse, of imprisonment, of people taking their own lives, you're talking about something that's really real. It's not just about changing mindsets. It's not just about changing language, important as all these things are. It's about changing the way people's lives are. And I started earlier by talking about Palestine, and I'm sorry, but it's in my head the whole time here as we're talking. I know that, for example, if you ask Palestinians about the Nakba, you know, 70 odd years ago, the creation of the state of Israel, they'll say every day is Nakba. And I think that that's one of the points about how colonization works.
And that comes back to the notion of coloniality, which you've been working with, which is the ongoing structures, which can be psychological, cultural, and so socioeconomic as well. And it's on those different levels that we might be working. I'm not sure how you are for time. We've been going about an hour now. I don't know if you'd like to draw things to a close with some reflections on perhaps, I think, for example, about recent developments in the South in terms of looking towards traveller history in the education system, education context, whether that's a useful and a helpful endeavour in terms of overcoming colonial structures and mindsets. So if there's anything that you think there is in sort of a policy area, either in the South or the North or elsewhere, that's an example of what governments are doing right or wrong, or is this all very much still kind of early days in terms of trying to undo this effect?
I think for me, and I'm on board with Bill, and I agree, we're not even trying to recreate or reconstruct an old world in the present. We're trying to tell the settled people in the nicest way. They're the guys who are stuck in the past, not the travellers. They're the ones that haven't changed any of the old systems and their attitudes, and they carried over labels that came with the colonizers. So I think it's more a case of breaking down the labels. I'd say it's mind over mentality, and not even just Douglas Hyde and people like that, but Edward Said, who was here in Sligo, talking about decolonization in 1980s, but it never really took off. In actual fact, he had several writers, Irish settled academias, attack him over it and challenge him over it and say there was no colonization and the experience was different. So I guess he went away at that time, rest his soul. And I'm also very much heartbroken what's happening to Palestinians. It's quite actually sad, on the other hand, too, what's happened to Israel. The centuries and centuries and centuries of oppression. And we know this, we sense this, we feel this. And this is what gives some people on the so-called margins a different perspective, because we're seeing the worst of systems and policies. So I think the real change comes within ourselves. I would say, well, how do we do it? Well, we're people who've come up with a narrative that hasn't been really conveyed before. So why was it not conveyed? Because we would say that it was being suppressed systematically, subconsciously, and sometimes out of fear. It wasn't because we have got an evil, malicious kind of government in power who are pressing the buttons just deliberately, hurting travellers or one group or another. They're not even aware they're doing it. In actual fact, when they try to help us, they make things worse. When they give us funding and support groups and so on and so forth, they actually made the psychological world fall to pieces, because people were getting lost in this system of who am I, where did I come from? So for me, it'll be decolonization. It's decolonializing your own mentality of thoughts. Like if I was to catch the word thinker that's been used today, and I look through it, I'll see where it came from. It came from the English. If I look through the other side of it, I'll see it's been put on Gaelic people. So why are we using labels and identities and so on and so forth that came with the colonizers? So it's becoming kind of like mindfulness and awareness. It's kind of like kidding ourselves, saying, where did these labels come from? Where did settle come from? Where does travel come from? But for me, it'll all be about a process of healing. And I don't think anyone can do this unless these groups with lived experiences and a kind of common sense that whatever we do cannot be a divide, and it cannot be to berate people, and it cannot be to use in any form of violence. Because for me, using racism and these labels don't exist in a Gaelic mentality. So if they don't exist there, why would we be still using them? So whatever we do has to be different. The mistake I think that's being made repeatedly, and I've heard Aldolph Reed Jr. tell us this on his podcast, who had pointed out to us in the 70s and the 80s that the American government had two branches just to deal with the black people. And that was the Department of Justice and the Department of Health. Who deals with travellers in the South? The Department of Justice and the Department of Health. So there is a lot of commonality between the colonial powers, subconsciously again, and their policies and their systems, okay, in that department. But if we have a platform and a place to go where Ulster University says, look, there's a platform there, it's a bit outside the colony, it's a place where we're able to draw resources and knowledge and information and perspective. And I'd say, sell your university, put all the resources into Travel Vision Foundation, and everything will be okay after a few months.
Okay. Give us a day or two.
Transfer the money over, sure.
If I could say, I would say that decolonization can be. I think sometimes it might even. I'm probably naive on this, but I was heartened to see the Supreme. I've mentioned it a couple of times on things, but Bernard had said there was a Supreme Court decision in the South here on where a case taken by a family in typical traveller accommodation, I think on land on the side of the road. But the Supreme Court had it had gone all the way to the Supreme Court, who decided to that the constitutional protection for the home, which here is pretty strong in the Constitution, and traditionally, for the reasons we've all talked about, is the laws were all, when we accept that the laws were constructed as part of a colony, and by a colony, as part of that whole process over centuries, we just have to accept that. And then we realize the state can look at itself and its own identity. And then it has to be sophisticated enough not to be threatened by that, and realize that it can broaden its definition of what's normal. And of course, that's very difficult when the state is not shining a light on itself or settle people, because it's normal. You know, we all know the real power is invisible, and the state in the South in particular Dublin has managed to make itself completely invisible. It's not to be investigated. It's normal. It's Irish. It suffered 800 years of oppression. As Bernard says, this is just not true, because it was the colony. It was for all that time. So that decision by the Supreme Court recognized that in 1922 all the laws had carried through, that there wasn't that there was continuity, that these laws therefore were coming from a time where they were designed not to allow certain ways of life on the island, and that by extending protection in the present to all different ways of living, essentially, that this would allow protection for travellers, not to be moved on by councils, not to be hounded and harassed and all that kind of thing, because once it's recognised as a home, it gains the protections of that, and they could take further. I imagine it's a good precedent, because now for the first time, even though they'd said about ethnicity, and the Taoiseach at the time was very keen to say that there was no law about it, but this court decision gives precedent. And to me, it seems a good way forward for decolonisation, because all the state has to do is, we're not trying to recreate the past, but in a progressive manner, it can keep extending its definition of what's normal to include things that we know, lifestyles that were normal on the island. And that goes for everyone from the most English of settlers to the indigenous, to the Gaelic people, whether they be on island speaking Irish or whether they be travellers and everything in between, which I think would benefit everyone in the long run.
I think that's a really interesting point in terms of invisibility, and also the role of the courts, because when I think about Latin America, which is kind of like, it's accepted that was a location of colonialism, that Ireland seems to be more contested still. Latin America, it's kind of beyond discussion, beyond dispute. And I think courts in Latin America have ruled very favourably for indigenous peoples, because there's a very favourable regional and international legal framework. So they've got somewhere to go. They've got a reference point. So we'll go to regional commission decisions or court decisions, or UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, the ILO 169, Covenant 169. That's all available, and it's all binding. Well, much of it is binding for them, not all much of it. So they have this whole sort of background whereby, obviously in practice anything happens, but legally, in legal terms, the courts, it's quite clear where they have to go. Whereas in Ireland, there isn't that sort of background or framework which the courts necessarily have to be working with. So that sort of decision is quite interesting, to do that sort of revision without having any sort of pressure from international law, because as far as I understand, it's like a very different context from other areas and other places where indigenous discourse and mobilization and this acceptance that colonialism was a big thing and happened has led to kind of significant legal developments regionally and internationally. So in a way, if we're talking about sort of undoing structures, it's probably much more complicated in an Irish context, I think, because there isn't that sort of, there's not a group of states that have lived the Irish experience in the same way as there's a group of states that have lived the Spanish colonial experience in Latin America and the aftermath. So I just wanted to add that in terms of contrast, thinking it is quite a situation.
Yeah. Do you guys think because Ireland had such a psychological pounding that went on for centuries, say like even the penal laws and the threat of martial law and transportation laws, that there's almost a trauma-filled island and also embedded with kind of colonial shame, is that somehow or another we can't talk about these things? And I just wanted to know, do you sense that, or is it just in my head?
Yeah, I come at it a different way. I mean, you probably, I'm sure you do know Steve Biko and Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa, but if you don't,
I looked him up actually when you mentioned him.
That would be a key reference, because I mean, without being flippant, there is a notion within that as alongside the structural political struggles, you think yourself free, and it kind of, just as you were talking, I was thinking that there's elements of that are true about the North as well. The blanket net, where objectively in the most colonized and restrictive, objectively unpleasant conditions you could possibly imagine, and yet the politics was at least the start about our ability to think ourselves into freedom before we engage with some of the structural stuff that Bill was talking about. So that's an important reference, and it's certainly part of the politics of liberation. There's no question about that. The second thing I wanted to throw into the conversation is just that point about violence, is that colonialism is so embedded in violence that it's almost, you get layer upon layer of genocide, enslavement, indenture, and it's colonialism is the language of violence. You can't escape that. So whenever people try to free themselves from us, it's not surprising that it's quite difficult to find some other counter narrative that doesn't doesn't see that as the way that the world is framed and formed and all the rest of it. But it's it's a defining feature of colonialism that as we observe Palestine, as we're saying, you can't escape from. It doesn't come from nowhere. But the final point, which maybe does begin to at least open up the question of how you frame the politics of resistance, is a concept that we do use in the book, mestizaje, which is about the mixedness of Irish identity, and we're very careful to say that we're only using that in the Irish context. We're not saying that this offers a definition of anybody else's struggle, but what it does suggest is that some of the things that you say, Bernard, are about transcending those old divisions, and I think mestizaje offers a way of doing that, of saying you can come up with a politics that transcends those differences. But at the same time, if you want to refer back to the politics of indigeneity and in the way that Claire was saying, then you probably should resist that, or at least critique that a wee bit, because there are certain groups, travellers particularly, but also Gaeltachts and Irish speakers in other parts of the island, who want to say that indigeneity is really an important way of framing our struggle and our situation. And in that context, we're not just the same as everybody else. The difference is really, really profoundly important to the way that the politics that we're going to develop. So as I observe the work that you're doing in Travelation, I think one of the questions you have is, well, what do we want to do with that idea, that question of indigeneity? Is it important? Is it not? Because as Claire was saying, if you do politically mobilize it, there are mechanisms where you can see a struggle developing, but there's also cost to that as well. So it's a quite a simple but also profound political question for all travellers: is how much does that indigenous identity matter in terms of the way that we construct our politics?
I think it's a very good question. I for me personally, I think when we say indigenous, because once upon a time the island was the island of visitors, and unless you defrost it with the ice many thousand years ago, then you're indigenous. But that means then nobody's indigenous to the island. So indigenous only comes in if there's something in contrast that isn't indigenous. So when we say indigenous, we're not talking about native Irish or settled people or Protestant. Everybody can be indigenous for what we care. We just want psychologically out of this trap. Let our microphone go home. Let us out. But indigenous.
But what does that mean?
Yeah,
how would everybody be indigenous? That's tangibly, what does that mean?
Okay, but I would say to you is that indigenous for us is in contrast of something, and that something is an Irish settled state that isn't indigenous. It didn't come from the island. It's in an English language. It uses English systems. There's nothing indigenous about it. It has claimed all the indigenous histories and the Gaelic histories and pushed travellers to one side and said, just nothing to do with you anymore. That's ours. And we're saying the whole settled philosophy or the whole settled mentality was also constructed by the English, either be the first settlement in Dublin or Cromwell. Remember the whole story about Cromwell put people off their lands and they became mobile and nomadic forever and so on and so forth. That's who travellers are. Okay, let's say that part is true. Let's say Cromwell did put us off our land and he marginalised us. What happened to our culture and our identity? We kept it on the margins. We kept that frequency, that mentality. Who stayed on the lands? Settled people. That's what the settlements were for, to keep settled people there. What does settlement really mean? It means that you stay there in one spot, or we'll transport you, we'll cut your ear off, we'll punish you, and you will now adopt what they did in the Surrender and Regrant. You adopt an English language, an English customs, English traditions, English language. And because it was a slow process, it didn't really hit the west of Ireland as it did the east of the island. But nevertheless, it's on autopilot since 1922, because nobody on the island, if you went up to them and said to them, hey guys, look, we made a bit of a mistake. For the last 100 years, we've been telling you this is an Irish college and these are Irish laws and these are Irish systems. When in actual fact, they're really not. They originate from Westminster. We are descendants ourselves from English. We took on the Irish settle label and we othered the travellers and we othered the Irish language and we othered Protestants, and that's how it is. If people knew that at a very young age at school or somewhere or another, you could have conveyed that, we wouldn't have been in classrooms, at the back of classrooms, isolated, cut off, wondering why we were called all these different names and been told that we are failed Irish, we're failed settled people, when we are in constant conflict with our own culture and identity. So we're in a world surrounded with people telling us that we're other and we're this, that, and the other. And until we got to the point where we started to work out and figure out, actually, this is not the way it is at all. There's been a lot of influences. We all grew up in this environment since 1922, believing that we're Irish, telling the world how Irish we are, how proud we are, how we fended off a big bad old empire. And yet nobody on the island could say, oh, these travellers, we don't know who they are. We don't know where they came from. But they've been here for thousands of years. So that part is the mentality part, I guess, and the decolonization maybe.
That's super interesting. Bill and Dylan, I don't know if you'd like to make any comments on what Robbie and
Well, I
Benjamin
think we've been going long enough, and anybody who gets through this podcast should get a little medal. But I will just
do pretty well, all right, I'm sure. But
add a couple of sentences to Robbie, just to clarify, you know, and maybe in a way, sort of, no, okay, to add to Robbie.
Yeah.
I have a friend here years ago. His kids and my kids were going to an integrated school, and he said to me one day he thought this was really great because his son had Protestant friends and Catholic friends and didn't know which was which. And I said that that's not the future that I wanted. I wanted a kid to recognize there were Protestant friends and Catholic friends. He knew who they were, and he was fine with that. You know, that togetherness shouldn't be based on ignorance or some sort of melding. So I think distinctions are important. I think, you know, if you're going to use the word indigenous, you have to say that there are some people have more claim to that title than others, right? And that has consequences then for those who don't have claim to that title. How do they get together? How do they live on the same patch of narrow land together? That's the challenge. It's not, you know, to call everybody normal, as you put it, Bernard, is not the solution. But also to call everybody by just one label is not the solution either. The point is we are all coming from different directions, and the trick or the secret is to try to figure how we get that together. I
agree with that, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. You would have said that even a lot of diversity, even in the Gaelic world, originally would have been is masked, and then the sort of typical nationalist identity would have in the 19th century would mask identities as well. And it goes back to what we're saying, that one way of decolonizing is actually to allow, because all we're saying there is like anyone can partake in indigenous culture, but not if that culture is to some extent still suppressed by identities of the state. Now, if the state widens its definition to include things that actually are Gaelic Ireland, instead of describing them as being a problem, which is what it did with traveller culture in the 60s, it decided that's a problem and needs to be changed. But instead, if it was recognized through the history that, okay, that's an old culture that was on the island for a long time, therefore we can broaden our definition of what is what is a way of life and all that. And then it would broaden it across the board for all people who came in at any given moment in Ireland's history, whether that be Protestants, Old English, settled people in the East, Irish speaking islanders, whatever. And I think that's perfectly possible. But I think it's, you know, it's and it would keep, you know, it keeps that diversity. The state has to have the confidence to allow the law. It did not just to inherit laws from the past, but to be confident enough to change them to allow identities across the whole thing. And actually, that goes down to even when we're talking about with Northern Ireland and unification and other things like this that we never even touched on and we won't go into now. But actually, yeah, maintaining that kind of extension of allowing extension of having the confidence to allow identities equals to have equal say or status within the island. If Dublin can't do that, even with travellers and with older cultures down here, it's not going to do it with anyone else either. You know?
Yeah.
Someone said to me a while back, it was a few months back, he said, I'm very, very proud of you, the way you spoke. You never mentioned colonization. So, because I never stopped talking about it. But I was just thinking there that you're talking about, again, I think we need to come up with something new, because if we keep repeating the same old practice, we're just extending class systems and class mentalities and so on and so forth. So you can imagine being on a platform where there is no travellers, there is no Protestants, there is no Catholic, racism doesn't have the same meaning. What would the conversation be like then? How would these people form a new reality, a new mentality, if they couldn't mention any of the colonial labels? Because we're in the colonial world, we keep caught up with these colonial labels and we keep ending going back to the same places. So maybe the future is a place outside of the colony, outside of colonial labels.
That's great. A really interesting conversation. Before we wrap up, did anybody want to say anything else? I think
All I was going to say is one thing is books like your book, Bill and Robbie, it's important. It is very important, isn't it? I believe that everything's put into this framework, all that work, connecting Ireland to all of the other colonial history, and even just writing things with that word on it, that it's this is the frame we're going to use, I think is the way, I do think is the way forward in Ireland. That's all I say there.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you.
that was a really interesting conversation. You've touched on many aspects of sort of colonial legacy and colonial presence and sort of complex temporalities and distinctions. And as you're saying, Bernard, we're all living with the colonial effect. We're all caught up in it. Even the English person, you know, we're sort of caught up in this colonial effect, and thinking beyond that is quite difficult and it's quite tricky. And I just wanted to acknowledge, before we end, you mentioned about your cousins, Bernard, and I'm very sorry to hear that, about their situation. I'm very sorry, and acknowledge the fact that travellers are living in difficult conditions sometimes, and to congratulate you for your work that you're doing to open up spaces, to create dialogue with different actors, as Bill has been saying, and Robbie, we all come from different perspectives, and from different sort of schools of thought and experience. So many thanks for engaging with us on that. Many thanks to all of you for participating. It's been a really thought-provoking session, and thinking towards this idea of, I never know whether decolonization is the right word, but sort of undoing the colonial structures or thinking outside the colony and existing outside the colony. I think these sort of experiences are very, very rich. So so congratulations to all of you, and many thanks for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Nice to see you again, my friend. I hope we see each other again. Bill, it was nice to meet you. It's actually an honor to meet you. And Claire, it's always lovely to meet you also. And
Yeah.
Dylan, I'm sick looking at you. But yeah, thank you all in one. And yeah, I appreciate it.
No, Slán.
All right, take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks.